Hey guys, it's Mel. Welcome to my channel. So, some of you might have noticed that I didn't actually end up doing a wrap-up for December. So in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about all the books that I read during December and January. I haven't ordered the books for 1 star up to 5 star or anything like that, predominantly because I had a really fantastic couple of reading months. I read some books that I really enjoyed overall, and I actually didn't rate anything really lower than a 3 star in those last 2 months. So I'm really happy about that. I think that was a really great ending to the year and a really wonderful start to 2020. So let's just dive straight into the books that I read. First up, I want to talk about 2 non-fiction books that I read in December and January. Non-fiction wasn't really a genre that I really explored particularly much or got a lot of enjoyment out of, with the exception of some memoirs that I've read. But this year I'm trying to change that, basically. I mean, I haven't set myself a specific goal of how many non-fiction books I plan to read throughout the year or anything like that. But I do want to just try picking up a few more non-fiction books and seeing where I go with them. So, the 2 books that I've read were, first of all, The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, I think is how you say her name. Anyway, it'll be here. This is a book about the 5 women who were the victims of Jack the Ripper. Unlike many books that talk about Jack the Ripper, this book does not talk about Jack himself. What it talks about are the victims. It talks about their lives and their backstories and how it came about that they were in the positions that they were in when Jack preyed upon them. What I think was really interesting was that almost every single account of Jack the Ripper says that the women that he killed were all prostitutes, and there's actually virtually no evidence to suggest that they were prostitutes. Mostly the evidence that was used to make that assumption was very much circumstantial and based on the fact that the women were sleeping rough. You don't have to be a rough sleeper and be a prostitute, and if you are a prostitute, that doesn't automatically mean that you sleep rough. The 2 things do not correlate at all, and that's what Hallie was talking about. And I find that really interesting. It sort of turns the entire case about Jack the Ripper, what he was doing and what the detectives were doing at the time to try and find him, on its head. And it shows that there was a lot of prejudice around at the time. One of the women that Jack the Ripper killed, there was evidence at the time to suggest that she was in fact a prostitute. And she was the one woman that was actually killed in a house, in her bed. There's no correlation. And anyway, correlation is not causation. It's not evidence. Making an assumption is not evidence. It's bad policing, quite frankly. I found this book phenomenal. I definitely gave it 5 stars. It's incredibly well written. It's incredibly well researched. It's incredibly readable. I was actually really enjoying going back to it every single time. Hallie paints the pictures of these women's lives in such a way that although you don't ever at any point think you're not reading non-fiction, it doesn't have that feeling that a lot of us, I think, associate with non-fiction of being kind of a plod. All of these women were living on the streets or living hard in Whitechapel at that time, basically because of a misogynistic, classist society. And then their deaths continued that misogynistic, classist outlook into what happened to them and why. As you can tell, I found the book very interesting and I am quite passionate about it. I really recommend that people give it a read. It gives you a big window into not just Jack the Ripper and his victims, but society at that time and in that place, and some of the ways that we still allow prejudice and allow our assumptions about people and their situation to determine our opinion of those people, even if the assumption is entirely wrong. And on that note, I would now like to talk to you about Finding Eliza by Larissa Berendt. This book is another really well written, really well researched, really interesting read. It gives you a really interesting and oftentimes quite distressing idea about how we perceive others in our society and how we have allowed constructs based on incorrect information to influence the way that we view people and the way that we allow the systems around us to oppress and ostracize those people. Much the same as the five, it throws out all of our assumptions out the window. So Eliza Fraser was a woman who was shipwrecked off the coast of northern Queensland and was taken in by the Butchulla people. And when she was eventually rescued and taken back to white Australian society, she spun this story about these horrific savages who really mistreated her, who were cannibals. This is back in the 1800s. But Larissa Berendt is looking at these colonial stories, predominantly in Australia, but looking at how stories from colonisation serve to marginalise Aboriginal people and to mistreat Aboriginal people. And so the story of how these people were barbaric, were cannibals, has allowed for this notion that they needed to be civilized, and of course in order to be civilized they needed to have an entirely different way of living thrust upon them. If they didn't conform to that way of living, then they would be taken from their homeland and taken and put into missions, and then we also go into the justification for taking babies and young children from their homes and put into white homes in order to civilize them again, and how colonial stories like the story told by Eliza Fraser about her apparent treatment by the Butchulla people really forms this whole narrative that justifies this. Again, as you can probably tell, I found it incredibly interesting and I was very passionate about it. It was quite confronting in a lot of ways because it's not always nice to read about how your country is totally messed up, but it was definitely worth a read, definitely very interesting, and I highly recommend it. Gave this one 5 stars as well. Moving on to some slightly less controversial books, and the rest of these books are the fiction books that I read during the months of December and January. So first up, we have Anne of Green Gables. This was a reread for me. I absolutely love Anne of Green Gables. I first watched the miniseries that was made in the 80s and then read the books, all of the books in the Avonlea series when I was about, I think, 11 or 12, and it was an absolute love affair. I completely adore these books, and I bought this beautiful, beautiful copy in December, and of course I had to read it straight away, partly because I wanted to see how much of what I feel about Anne of Green Gables is nostalgia and how much of what I feel about Anne of Green Gables I would still feel after I read it, and I did. I still give this book 5 stars. I'm not sure how much information I need to give you about Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. I feel like most people would have at least heard of Anne of Green Gables by now, but Anne of Green Gables is the first in a series, and it follows our main character Anne, who is a young orphan girl. We meet her first in this book when she is 11. She is taken in by 2 older brother and sister, Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, who live in Green Gables on Prince Edward Island off the coast of Canada, and it's a bit of a mistake. They want a boy to help out around the house and in the farm, and they get a girl. And not only do they get a girl, they get a girl who is whimsical and imaginative and extremely talkative and makes constant mistakes and is constantly being ruled by her imagination and letting it run away with her and getting into all sorts of scrapes and talking like she's some kind of fairy princess or something, and they just don't know what to do with her, but they completely fall for her and she ends up staying at Green Gables, and it's about her growing up, the friendships that she makes, and it's just beautiful. Characters are beautifully written and the setting of Prince Edward Island is incredible, and when I read this book for the, I don't know, this time, I desperately want to go to Prince Edward Island now. So I also read The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. This is another book that I really enjoyed. Probably not as much as I have enjoyed some of his other books. My favourite of his books is Neverwhere. So I think this was probably more like a 4-star read for me, but that's still really good and I still really enjoyed it. The Graveyard Book is about a young boy called Nobody, who, when he's a very young baby, something terrible, a tragedy befalls his family and he is orphaned, and he winds up escaping from the situation into a nearby graveyard, which is populated by ghosts. And so Nobody, or Bod, as he is known, is raised by ghosts, and it's just about Bod growing up and discovering the secrets of what happened to his family and taking action on that. And yeah, it's well written, it's well paced, either middle grade or very young adult, but yeah, it's really well written and really enjoyable, and definitely give it a read. The next book that I read is called A Long Way Home by Sara Brierely, and this is actually a memoir. This is about a man who, when he was a young boy, basically he kind of accidentally wound up getting separated from his family and ended up in Calcutta and didn't know how to get home. And it's the story, him telling his story about how he was homeless on the streets of Calcutta and the various different things that happened to him, and then him managing to get helped by this group of people that organised an adoption for him in Australia, in Tasmania, and he moved to Tasmania and moved with this family, and then it's about him growing up with this family but always kind of feeling apart from Australians and apart from his family and not feeling like there was something missing. And then when he's in his early 20s, he starts to try and find his family and find out what happened and find out where they are and sort of how this all came about. I think I probably gave this one a 3.5 stars. I definitely enjoyed it and I definitely found it interesting. I didn't necessarily love it as much as the other books I've mentioned. I didn't find the writing style quite as good, but then having said that, Sara Brierely himself, I don't believe is an author, so you know, it's a bit different when you're writing a book and that's not actually your career. But yeah, it's really interesting and definitely well worth a read. I said 3.5, I might up it to 4 stars. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest with you, but I definitely think it's worth a read. And like I said, it's very interesting. Next up, we have Home by Larissa Berendt. Boy, okay, so talking about confronting books to do with Australian Aboriginal issues and some of the various different policies that have impacted Australian Aboriginal people in a negative way. These concepts are very much explored in Home. So Larissa Berendt also wrote Finding Eliza. Home is a fictional work, and we start with Celia, and she starts talking about going back to this mission somewhere in Central Australia, and her family, her dad's family, lived there. She is a very well-to-do lawyer in Sydney or Melbourne. From there, we go back through the various different generations. So we go back to her great-grandmother, I think, and we start looking at this young woman whose name I've totally forgotten, but this young woman who was taken from her family when she was about 12 and put with a white family a long way away, and she doesn't really know the distance or how to get back to where her family are. Now, I was always under the impression that the whole policy of taking Aboriginal children from their families and their homes and placing them with white Australian families was all about an attempt to civilise these children and give them opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise. As bad as that is, this book showed me that it was actually worse, which is something that I didn't know and was quite distressed to discover. So, like I said, that's awful. But this particular girl wasn't taken from her family and put into a loving, caring, white Australian family that would give her an opportunity for education and what have you. No, she was taken from her family and put into service with a white family. So she was basically made into the kitchen maid. Because apparently being the kitchen maid to a white family will give you better opportunities and make you more civilized than living with your own family. I just honestly was appalled to read that, and I feel like I should have known that, but I did not. So we follow this young woman as she lives with this white family, and then we follow her as she meets a man. So we follow her life as she marries this man, and then the children she has, and then their upbringing, and then the children and how they then try and deal with that and what happens to them as a result. This book is really well written and gives you a fantastically wonderful insight into how a policy like the Stolen Generation policy, which I'm sure had a different name when it was in effect, how that can have an impact not just on the person who was taken, but on generations after them. So her situation and the flow-on effects from what happened to her and what continued to happen to her was felt by her children and by her children's children and everyone around them. And it's a really fascinating and very confronting, but very well written and very interesting and definitely worth a read. It's really powerful, and I highly recommend that you give it a read. So that was Home by Larissa Berendt. So moving on to Jingo by Terry Pratchett. I actually read this or listened to this on Audible as part of my figuring out what I think of listening to audiobooks, which I'm doing a series on, so I will link the one where I talk about Jingo in the description below. I won't go into a huge amount of detail because, like I said, I've talked about this in another video. This is my favourite Discworld novel by Terry Pratchett, which is saying a lot because I absolutely love Terry Pratchett and love the Discworld. Absolutely love the characters in this particular book. So this is in the Watch series. It's ostensibly about two countries going to war over an island, but the island was an island that suddenly just appeared out of the water and basically disappears again. So it's kind of about the pointlessness of war and, you know, the stupidity of fighting over land or over things that aren't necessarily really that important or only strategically important, not actually important. So it's just fantastic and I love it. So 5 stars again for that one. Next up we have The Invisible Women's Society by Nikki Gemmell. This is another book that I listened to on Audible and I really, really, really enjoyed it. I believe they gave it 4 stars. It is a contemporary Australian book. It's about 4 women who go on a trip out into the outback to where they grew up, and it's about them sort of sharing their lives together and finding out more about each other and the not necessarily great situations in which they find themselves or the various different difficulties that they're having, and yeah, it's really fantastically written and really interesting. I talk a lot more again about the experience of listening to the audiobook in the same video that I've linked below for Jingo. So if you want to know more about that, definitely go and check out that video. But yes, 4 stars. I think that I'm actually upgrading it as we speak to 4.5 stars. I thought it was really great, really well written. Just a few things that weren't necessarily my cup of tea. The next book that I want to talk to you about is the book that I started the year with. So I got this for Christmas, so you would have seen it in my Christmas haul video. So I actually started reading it on the 28th of December, and then I finished reading it in January. So it's kind of that crossover, and it was amazing. I absolutely adored this book. And that book is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I have heard some mixed things about this book. I have heard some people say that it was one of their favourite books of all time, and I've heard other people who say that they're not particularly fans of it. So it is quite a polarising book, I think, but I just thought that it was beautiful. And I'm discovering something that I feel like I probably should have known about myself and my reading tastes before, and that is that I don't mind if a book doesn't really have a particularly obvious or well constructed plot, as long as it is really beautifully and lyrically written. And that's what this book is. I thought that the writing was just amazing. Like I said, it was so lyrical and it just flowed together really nicely and just painted this amazing, vivid image. I've heard say that there isn't a plot. I don't agree with that. I think there is a plot, but it's not the most important part of the story of the book, and it is kind of convoluted anyway. I don't feel like I need to go into too much description of this. I feel like most people have some idea of what this book is about, but basically we have 2 characters who are pitted against each other as very young children and brought up by magicians to be pitted against each other and to create magical things as part of this greater competition that they're in. And the place where this competition is taking place is the Night Circus. The Night Circus is a very unique circus. It appears at night and it appears without warning, and it's only open at night. There's a lot of really strange things in the Night Circus, but yeah, it's just, I think this is the kind of book that if you like lyrical, enchanted, twisting, turning writing, then I think you will like this book. If you are a plot-driven reader or even a character-driven reader, I don't necessarily know that you'll like this book. There are many, many characters in this book, and not all of them are, in fact, none of them are given a huge amount of backstory, but they're all painted really vividly. It's much more of a descriptive book. It's almost visual. I don't know if that makes any sense, but anyway, this was an amazing beginning to 2020 for me. I just absolutely loved it, and I'm super excited to read The Starless Sea, and I'm hoping to get to that really soon. So that was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. The next book that I want to talk to you about is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. I feel like I probably don't need to go into a huge amount of detail again about this book. I think this is very popular. I would imagine that most people would know about this book, but I will just talk about it briefly. So Carry On is set in a magical boarding school in the UK, and the main character Simon and his roommate Baz are students at the Watford Academy, and it is all about this horrible villain who is targeting Simon and who is trying to destroy magic and destroy magic kind, and Simon is kind of just trying to go to school but also trying to stop this thing from taking over and destroying magic. Baz, his roommate, is also his arch nemesis. He absolutely can't stand Baz. His best friend Penny and he are top of the school. Well, Penny's top of the school. She's incredibly smart. Simon kind of just cruises by with her help. And as you can probably tell, there are a lot of similarities between Carry On and Harry Potter. So when I first started reading this book, I was finding it actually a little bit difficult to read because it really read like fan fiction about Harry Potter, which I have no problem with. It was a little bit tricky to get into, but then I started enjoying it. Well, I decided to enjoy it as a book in and of itself, and once I decided that, I actually started to really enjoy it as a book written in and of itself. There is a lot of stuff that is quite different. The characters, although on the face of it again look quite similar, they're not. They're definitely uniquely themselves. I really enjoyed the initial hatred between Simon and Baz and the eventual love that blossoms between Simon and Baz. I really enjoy their relationship and the build-up of their relationship. I'm not a person that necessarily likes, in fact I usually dislike hate to love, but I really enjoyed it in this particular instance. I think Rainbow Rowell is just amazing. She's just such a great young adult author. She writes really well paced, really well characterized books. I love them. I think they're great, the two that I've read, and I'm excited to read more. Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. 5 stars, definitely give it a read. Next up is Esme's Wish by Elizabeth Foster. I won't talk very much at all about this book because I do actually have a dedicated review that I will link below. So go and check that out if you want to know my thoughts on that. But I will just say that I really enjoyed this book and I gave this 4 stars again as well. It is a middle grade fantasy. It is about a young girl called Esme who goes through a portal to another world called Aeolia, and she meets 2 young people around her same age, and they become friends and they start to look into the disappearance of start to look into the disappearance of Esme's mum and start to look into this mystery surrounding some artifacts from Aeolia and Esperance's history. And yeah, it's really well written and really enjoyable. I think the reason I gave it 4 stars is because there are a few inconsistencies and convenient plot devices that work in a middle grade book, but I am not the intended audience for that, so didn't necessarily work for me. But like I said, I gave it 4 stars because overall I really enjoyed reading the book. The final book that I want to talk about is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I initially gave this book 4 stars. I've since upgraded it to 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was a fantastic beginning book. I really liked Jude's character. I really liked the way that she thinks about her life and approaches the situation that she's in. I like the way that Holly Black paints the fairy world and the fairies as cruel. Yeah, I feel like it was much more realistic to how fairies were imagined in mythology. I'm currently reading The Wicked King, which I am also really enjoying, so I'll let you know my final thoughts on that one in my February wrap-up. But The Cruel Prince is definitely a great beginning book and I highly recommend it. So those were all the books that I read in December and January. As you can tell, I had a fantastic couple of months reading. It was a really wonderful way to finish out 2019 and to start 2020. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please comment below if you have read any of the books that I talk about in this video, or comment below and let me know what you read in January. What was your favourite? What was your least favourite? How was your reading last couple of months? I'd really like to chat. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to my channel. I'll see you later.